Do you have a
Especially when I started sitting in. Well,
do you want to move further up?
oh, that's way better.
Okay.
Oh no, this is okay. It looks like very aesthetic.
It's a good area.
Sorry. So I did that.
Yeah.
We'll be starting in just a minute. And for those of you who are online, thanks for being patient. We'll be right with you. I'm sorry.
Yes,
It's being recorded and it's also live now.
you have time.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. Well, I mean,
Back there, right? Wonderful. Okay, then. Oh, except that I just turned it off, but I think I fixed it. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so. Okay, then I think we will begin. Welcome everyone in the room and everyone on Instagram or YouTube to the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center's Fall Lunch and Learn / Fire Right Now on Race and the Elections. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We are so excited for this event today. Now, before we get any further, a quick disclaimer, just so you all know, or a piece of information, because it was sort of how it was billed, I just want to make sure that you know that this event is being live streamed to YouTube and to Instagram. And the Q&A will be live streamed as well. It is also being recorded so we can post it on YouTube and as a reel, not the whole thing, but part of it is a reel later. So just want you to know that in case you have any concerns about being recorded. If you are just sitting in your seats, you will not be on camera, but your question will be heard when you ask it. So For that said, I would like to get us started. Welcome, as I said. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Clark Kaplan, and I am the Executive Director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center here at American University. ARPC is an interdisciplinary hub for the research and practice of intersectional racial justice. Our job is to bring together scholars, educators, artists, community-based change makers, and policy advocates to put research into action for social change. We do this by generating cutting-edge knowledge, developing anti-racist frameworks for policy analysis, and disseminating vital educational resources. Our work focuses in 4 key areas: reproductive justice, policing and mass incarceration, climate, land, and environmental justice, and educational access and equity. And as you know, those are the topics we'll be discussing primarily here today. Now, I want to start off by saying that our Lunch and Learn series, this is a great turnout, so some of you may know this, though some of you may not. Our Lunch and Learn series is not new. We've been holding the series for the last 2 years as part of our goal to make sure that putting research into action includes enabling and empowering students to function as change makers in the world around them. This series puts together faculty experts on student-focused panels to help have faculty share their research on critical issues that are of immediate concern to student life. These events have been on things like the racialized politics of sexualized violence, on race and environmental policy, what else have we done? Educational equity and affirmative action, bunch of events. So I encourage you to look back if you like this event and you want to go back and sort of see old recordings. We have a lot of those recordings posted on our reels on our Instagram account if you want to go back far enough. And then, of course, some of you may also be familiar with our Fire Right Now series, our rapid response Instagram Live series that offers racial justice analysis on current political and social issues, particularly those that cut across our 4 areas. And of course, we got to this summer and thought, what are we going to do this fall? What are we going to do this fall for our Fire Right Now? And lo and behold, the idea of a crossover event that brought together Fire Right Now and the Lunch and Learn series was born. So thank you for being here with us. Before we talk about elections today and the ways that elections this year are, like they always are, a moment when racial justice is on the ballot, I'd like to introduce our speakers who have joined us today. Our first panelist, Dr. Tracy Weeks, is a professor of sociology and the director of the Center for Health, Risk, and Society at American University. She's here to talk to us about reproductive justice and race in the current election cycle. Dr. Weeks is a professor of sociology. Oh, I already said that, sorry. Dr. Weeks is a national expert on abortion care, policy, culture, and politics in the US. Her current research addresses how insurance payers, private nonprofit organizations, and philanthropy pay for abortion. She also studies the ways that abortion exists as a cultural product in politics, mass media, and the social imagination. Her research has long focused on the specific role of abortion later in pregnancy and on the demedicalization of medication abortions. She's the former U.S. Programs Director for the Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation and co-founder and director of Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health at UC San Francisco. In 2021, she received the Charles S. Schultz Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Public Health Association. And I will say, because we love to say this at our Lunch and Learns, that Dr. Weeks teaches amazing classes on key issues of reproductive politics. I think that you're teaching your complex issues class right now. In the spring, she's teaching, if you're interested in these issues, she's teaching a complex problems course on the sort of knotty, thorny issues around medication abortion. So if you're interested, right, the abortion pills, as we all call them. So great thing to look out for. Our second speaker, Dr. Malini Ranganathan, is the Associate Professor in the Department of Environment, Development, and Health at the School of International Service at American University, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on environmental justice and environmental sustainability and global health. A political ecologist and critical geographer by training, she studies environmental, land, and housing struggles in the US and in India. Here in Washington, D.C., her work looks at the intersections between abolitionist politics, gentrification, and climate justice. And you're going to get a chance to hear her talk about some of those ideas and concepts today. If you were like, wait, what are all these things? She's published over 20 journal articles and 2 books, and won the 2023 Harold M. Rose Award for Anti-Racism Research and Practice from the American Association of Geographers. And unsurprisingly, she's here to talk to us today about the role of climate and environmental justice as racial justice issues in the upcoming election. And our third speaker, Dr. Lily Wong, is an associate professor of literature and critical race, gender, and culture studies here at American University, and also serves as one of the associate directors of AU's ARPC, Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. We're honored to get to work with her. Her research focuses on the politics of affective labor, racial capitalism, and trans-Pacific coalitional movements mobilized specifically around decriminalization and demilitarization. She's one of the founding board members of the Society of Sinophone Studies. She serves on the advisory board of Verge Studies in Global Asias, and she supports API Women Leads Intergenerational Participatory Action Research as an academic advisor. She's the author of the book Trans-Pacific Attachments, Sex Work, Media Networks, and Affective Histories of Chineseness, the co-editor of Dimensions of Violence, Resistance, and Becoming, Asian Americans and the Opening of the COVID Era special issue in the Journal of Asian American Studies, and the co-editor of the newly released collection, Trans-Pacific Undisciplined. And Dr. Wong has the remarkably complex job today of talking to us about state violence in the current election and how it crosses several areas of political organizing and concern. And I will say right now, our fourth speaker on educational equity and access was not able to join us today, being the way it is, but we will still be incorporating a discussion of educational equity and access into our conversation. And I encourage you to bring up questions about it. I think it's something that we all feel very excited and comfortable talking about. Before we go any further, I do want to just take a moment and just shout out to our incredible co-sponsors. We've been so lucky with this event. In addition to our Department of Program co-sponsors, Arab World Studies, Asian Pacific Diaspora Studies, Literature, Sociology, American Studies, Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies, African American Studies, Latinx Studies, and the Department of Justice, Law, and Criminology. A lot of support. We're grateful for the support that made all the food possible and all the equipment things. We also, I think at least as importantly, have been lucky to have support from a number of student organizations who have co-sponsored this event and who have continued to support us as we've sought to do outreach. This includes the Students for Reproductive Justice, CNET, the Indigenous Initiative, AU's Asian American Student Association, AU's Brave Space, and Students for Change, and Sister. And if I missed you, or please stand up. But I think I got everybody. We are so aware that if our events don't speak to students, then they're not worth doing. So that is all of the intro and the fancy I'm going to do. We're actually going to get started. And I'm going to switch hats for a minute from the MC for a minute to give you a bit of an overview from my own approach of why we would choose as a radical abolitionist research center to host an event on elections and racial justice at a moment when there is so much debate in racial justice communities about the role and function of voting in elections, particularly in our two-party system at this political moment. And I will say that part of our impulse in holding this event was to recognize the extent to which scholars, activists, and community members who we respect within racial justice scholarship and racial justice organizing have articulated very different, diverging, and all historically and politically informed perspectives on what the role of voting and elections are at this moment. As we move closer to the election, we wanted to take this opportunity to not just talk about these issues in the context of the election, but also to frame for you how we understand the role of voting and elections as part of racial justice practice. Because we know that if we're hearing these different opinions, you are too. And as young voters, I think what you often hear is, just go vote, just go vote. Don't you care? It's your job. If you don't vote, you can't complain. And we're not super interested in that univocal, one-note message. We're much more interested in having a conversation with you about the racial politics and stakes of not just voting as an act, but elections as a larger social process. So, history has shown us that there is no single election or series of elections that are going to transform this deeply flawed and complex society to one of full racial equity and justice. If we didn't know it before, we definitely saw it when we all declared the post-racial America in 2008, only to discover that not only was there profound anti-Black racist backlash, but in fact even Barack Obama was not racist. We know that no elected official will save us, whatever their party, whatever their race, whatever their gender. And we know that voting, like every institutional measure or process, reveals as much about the limits on access based on socioeconomics, workplace freedoms, disenfranchisement, carceral policies, zoning, transportation access, as it does about political commitment or involvement. So we know voting isn't the answer. But we also know that for 150 years, Black and brown people in the United States have fought unceasingly for the freedom to vote. They've lost their jobs, they've lost their homes, they've lost their freedom, and they've lost their lives in the pursuit of free access to voting. This isn't because they're Jews. It is because they understood what we still know now, that access to voting is a measure of who is and is not allowed to be part of the national body. And by this I mean, it's not just the campaigns to limit voting, which there are many of right now across the country. It's not just that those campaigns are rooted in long-standing strategies to strip marginalized communities of their political power and voice, right? But it's also because those campaigns are a window into a continuing white supremacist belief that BIPOC people in the United States, poor people, non-US born people, the formerly incarcerated, and I will say that all those other categories after BIPOC are also disproportionately BIPOC people, should shoulder the burdens of citizenship, even as they are stripped of the rights of citizens. So let me say that again. The attempt to keep people from voting shows the belief that people in the United States who are marginalized, minoritized, and racialized should shoulder all the burdens of citizenship. They can go to prison, they can be prosecuted, they can be war, they can pay taxes, without the rights of citizens. So we know that elections are not magic bullets. They are not guarantees of racial democracy. They are, however, crucial terrains of struggle. In the process of campaigns and protests against candidates, in town halls and counter movements, in uncommitted campaigns, and canvassing from door to door. Issues are exposed, movements are built, and the foundations are laid for ongoing change. Whoever wins and whoever loses, right? That's whose work is happening. That is the process of the election, not the vote. So, we do know that voting won't save us. And that's why we are not here to tell you who to vote for or whether to vote at all. But we do believe that informed engagement with electoral politics is a vital tool for creating the conditions for us to save ourselves. And by this I mean, it is in the act of engaging with electoral politics that we put pressure on politicians to move toward the issues we care about. It is also in the process of electoral politics that we affect not just the top of the ballot, but all the way down the systems that exist. You know, I heard a fabulous statistic the other day that said there are 520,000 offices, elected offices, that will be voted on in this election. 520,000. Only 2 of those offices are the president and the vice president. Only 535 of them are Congress. The majority of the offices that people will be voting on election day that will affect the day-to-day survivability and vulnerability to premature death or opportunities for well-being are at the level of your city, your county, your state, your school district. They are ballot measures and bond propositions. They are the opportunities that you have to shape the conditions of your everyday life that have nothing to do with imagining that some single charismatic leader will save us. So, that's where we're starting the conversation. And from there, I'm going to open up to our incredible panel. And I want to start off by just framing this conversation of racial justice on the ballot. I want to ask each of you, we've put these 3 issues out there: reproductive politics, climate and environmental justice, and state violence. How are each of these key issues, which we've seen talked about all over the place in the media, right? We see these talked about in the media. I've watched so many reproductive politics panels, and yet they are so often not framed as racial justice issues. Or they say repro, climate, violence, and race. So how are these issues actually all racial justice issues? So I'm going to start, Dr. Meeks, will you go first?
Can you all hear me? Okay, great. So it goes without saying that reproductive politics are central to this election. Presidential candidate and current Vice President Kamala Harris has made expanding reproductive freedom a central argument in her campaign. She promises to reaffirm the right to abortion, contraception, and IVF nationally. She attacks candidate and former President Donald Trump for appointing the 3 members of the U.S. Supreme Court whose votes were necessary to overturn the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, which had previously established a national right to most abortion. By comparison, candidate Trump claims that states should be able to decide the status of abortion, and at one point promised to make insurance coverage over IVF. Project 2025 lays out the proposed agenda for the Republican Party should they be victorious, explicitly calls for contrary policies that equate to a national ban on abortion, the elimination of mandatory insurance coverage for contraception, and legal rights for fetuses and embryos that would limit some forms of fertility intervention. Ballot initiatives in 10 states will decide the future of abortion rights. In 8 of these states, abortion was significantly restricted following the 2022 Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe. But what does all of this have to do with race? I'll briefly describe a few obvious reasons and a few more complicated relationships, but I'm happy to answer a lot more questions later. Starting with the most simplistic. Before Dobbs, women of color disproportionately relied on abortion for the management of undesired pregnancy. Black women had an abortion rate 4 times that of white women, and Hispanic women's rate was 2 times that of white women. The reasons reflect a legacy of historical disadvantage, including reduced access to the tools to control fertility, reduced trust in the healthcare system, and fewer financial resources to adapt to an unexpected pregnancy. We can call this a form of structural racism. However, women of color also had more barriers to accessing abortion before laws. Since 1976, the Federal Hyde Amendment has prohibited the use of federal Medicaid to pay for abortion care. While 18 states use their state funds for this insurance coverage, women of color are more likely to live in the states that prohibit this coverage. These same states are also the states that ban or severely restricted abortion and are home to the largest number of Black people. Texas, Florida, and Georgia are with the highest population of the highest Black population, Mississippi and Louisiana. Texas and Florida are also home to significant numbers of Latinos. But it would be naive to think that the reason that abortion is on the ballot is that people care or worry about access to abortion for these communities of color. Instead, it is whiteness that has made abortion salient in this election. And what do I mean by that? Since Dobbs, the media has fed us a litany of tragic stories of women with wanted pregnancies that have taken a turn for the worse and whose denials of abortion care seem extraordinary. In most cases, doctors are painted as in distress for not being able to help these women, who might bleed out in the parking lot, turn septic while waiting for the fetus to die naturally, or risk future fertility for a doomed pregnancy. Just yesterday, researchers released a new study documenting that how the rate of fetuses who died shortly after birth has increased since Dobbs. The protagonist in these stories is usually white, very heterosexual, and sometimes a former supporter of pro-life policies. Why does it matter that these people are centered in the post-Dobbs story and elections? It matters because when centered, the solutions forwarded to redress Dobbs risk re-entrenching reproductive policies shaped by race and discriminatory practices. The major solution endorsed by Harris is to reinstate Roe v. Wade, a legal framework that made accessing abortion especially hard for low-income and racialized populations. So now let's talk about the ballot initiatives. Reflecting the structure of Roe, all but one of these initiatives allows for abortion only up to the point of potential fetal viability. Often thought of as a legal compromise, this concept maintains abortion law within the criminal code and empowers doctors to determine when abortion labor and pregnancy are allowable. What this has meant historically is that states can assert an interest in potential fetal life, historically weaponized against women of color, not in the context of abortion, but in the context of continuing pregnancies. In a new report examining the first year after Dobbs, Pregnancy Justice documented 210 pregnant women who were who faced criminal charges for conduct associated with pregnancy loss, and birth. Only 5 of these had anything to do with abortion. In approximately 2/3 of these cases, substance use was the only allegation made against the pregnant person. What might seem unexpected in this story is that over 2/3 of the individuals identified as white, reflecting a new attention to punishing white women for failure to manage their pregnancies appropriately. And while women of color are disproportionately targeted by state surveillance and neglect in these cases, white women are viewed as needing to be saved by the state. But even broader than the challenge created by these possibility limits in the law, the ability of the initiatives to ensure access to abortion for low income and people of color is limited. These new laws will need to be interpreted by state Supreme Courts as to whether they overturn existing prohibitions on care delivery, such as rules of waiting periods, bans on telemedicine, unnecessary facility requirements, and most importantly, prohibitions on the use of state funds to pay for anything abortion, all of which disproportionately impact low-income people and communities of color. The sad white protagonists of the media stories may get their special abortions restored, but many people will not. Colorado offers us a bright front. The ballot initiative would reverse the state's prohibition on the use of state funds, and if it passes, residents eligible for state Medicaid will no longer have to pay out-of-pocket for abortion care. Putting this into perspective, the average price of abortion is about $600 in the first trimester and somewhere between $800 and $25,000 beyond that. It is not new information that most Americans cannot afford for a $400 expense. In Colorado, Latinos make up the highest portion of Medicaid recipients compared to all other racial groups. American Indian, Alaska Native individuals also have significantly higher rates of Medicaid. But reproductive equity isn't assured even in the ballot process. Currently, 27% of abortions in Colorado are medication abortions via telephone. And if Colorado follows the lead of most states, this service will not be a feasible benefit for people with state Medicaid, meaning that insurance coverage, while a benefit, may result in having to recruit inpatient care for these populations to obtain a insurance coverage abortion. You might be asking why I took you so far down the weeds of these initiatives. I do it to remind all of us that racialized implications of reproductive politics are traditionally ignored during elections and the subsequent policies that result from those elections. Further, whiteness, Christian nationalism, and pronatalism are often obscured in the discussion of the racialized implications of reproductive politics on the ballot. However, in this election, they are central to what is on the ballot and what we can expect, regardless of who wins the presidential election or the outcomes of the ballot initiatives.
Thank you, Dr. Weeks. I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Rondon.
Thank you so much to the RPC for hosting this discussion. I have to say it brings me no small amount of joy to be in a room full of so many students of color. It's really, really heartwarming. And I have to say that's probably a testament to the trust that ARPC has built up among us students of color on campus. So thank you all for being here and welcome. Can I just ask, how many of you are voting for the first time this election? One? Okay, so maybe a quarter of the room. So this is not the second time I'm voting. I actually became a citizen only in 2020. I was a junior voter for a while. You know, as I was telling my friends, really, probably before the sessions, it's a pretty bleak topic, and talk about climate and race and elections. When you think about climate justice and the elections, it's one of those issues that in some ways connects to just about every other issue that you would think voters care about, right? From the price of food, to home insurance, to militarism and war and ongoing warmongering and genocide, to healthcare and health equity, to worker safety, to catastrophic hurricanes, to the racial, heteropatriarchal systems and sustained inequities across all these areas. You name it, climate change is in some direct or indirect way connected to other things that people care about. The irony is that climate change is the issue that's often the least important for voters and candidates alike. A Pew Center survey released in February of this year found that both Dems and Republicans rank climate change as a far lower policy priority than any other ballot issue. So typically the economy ranks as very important to voters, followed by healthcare, Supreme Court appointments, and foreign policy. And climate change comes in around 10th after gun policy, abortion, and as Sarah said, it's something called racial inequity, right? Which is some island all of itself that you should either care about or not care about. It's sort of like ecological violence and think of it that way. But there you have it. Of course, Dems are substantially more likely than conservatives to prioritize climate change. Around 60% of Dems say it's important, and 11% Republicans. And within the youth vote, that number goes up even more, right? So the progressive youth are probably the most likely to care about climate change. But really, you know, whichever survey you turn to, it's sort of one of those middling issues. It's not the most important, it's the least important, it's kind of in the middle. And climate change into everyday stories, things that really matter, right, for the person, the average or the person next door. So take for example, extreme heat. We've seen the hottest years in recorded history last year, right, 2023, 2024. Such that Antonio Guterres, the UN chief, has called it we're in the era of global warming. 2023, July 2023 was hotter by 1.5 degrees centigrade than all previous recorded Julys. So if you know the world of climate policy, you know this number 1.5 degrees is often thought about as this sort of tipping point, right? We're trying to actually keep temperatures this essentially below 1.5 degree rise as compared to industrial. And so the fact that we had a month last year that actually surpassed that 1.5 degree very warming, we're still not really on track to maintain that 1.5 degree increase as compared to industrial. So it's pretty serious, right? But now talking about race, ethnicity, and kind of the longer histories of understanding climate injustice, I think we can all agree that the roots of climate inequality can be found in historical processes of indigenous genocide, land grab, African enslavement, plantation capitalism, punitive labor, and carceral regimes, right? So any root causal analysis of climate vulnerability must show you that we cannot treat climate and environmental justice as separate, right, from these longer histories. And that broader socio-structural and historical analysis is also borne out by facts and figures in terms of the race, class, and gender ethnicity dimensions of climate vulnerability and climate catastrophe. So getting back to heat, right, we know that, for instance, heat-related emergency department visits are particularly high along people of color, partly because they suffer underlying conditions of asthma and respiratory illness and other things that, for exactly the same reasons that you had a disproportionate number of people of color succumb or get very sick from COVID. It's very similar to how people succumb and to heat-related illness. Phoenix, everyone from Arizona? Yeah. Okay, well, Phoenix, Arizona was extremely hot in 2023-2024. Reported 645 deaths, right, which is an increase of 50% compared to 2022. So we see a huge spike. The risk of death from extreme heat is very high comparatively for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous populations. Why? Because these are our workers, our farm workers, people who work outside in the construction industry, right? They're in poorly ventilated factories packing around Amazon warehouses, right? So if you look at the labor market and you look at who actually does our most dangerous job, then it's not surprising that heat-related deaths, right? In addition to the other issues that talked about, like asthma and respiratory illness, right? It's not surprising that people of color bear the brunt of this. Then you have increasing catastrophic hurricane and flooding. So in my course, which I teach SISU 250, Environmental Sustainability and Global Health, I've taught for 11 years, we have students identify historic hurricanes in the United States, and they have to look at social vulnerability that kind of predispose certain groups to the negative effects of that hurricane. And for the longest time, Hurricane Katrina was one that many students looked at because it's an important one, 2005, New Orleans. But now we've reached this tragic place where we actually have no shortage of hurricanes to examine, right? So whether it's Hurricane Maria and Irma that completely wreaked havoc and continues to actually have devastating effects on Puerto Rico, to, of course, the ones in Texas, right? To the most recent ones in the Southeast, which were Helen and Milton. Now, something that didn't really reach the news, but who was most affected by those hurricanes tearing into the Southeast? It was outdoor migrant workers, right? Georgia turns out to be one of the states employing the most migrant farm workers on an H-2A visa. You haven't heard of an H-2A visa? Well, it sucks. An H-2A visa, you can hardly get health insurance. FEMA does not provide disaster relief, right? 35,000 H-2A Latinx workers are completely stranded, left without a home in the wake of these hurricanes, right? So, of course, these statistics are very, very troubling and they're very, very blatant. I'm coming to the candidates, right? Vice President Harris has said very little about her plans to tackle climate change. I really looked hard. I looked hard and I scoured the news. What has she said? Back in the day, she said, along with President Biden, that it's existential threat. She's being much more careful now. And in fact, in the debates, she went as far as not only to hold up military, right? She had a very jingoistic stance on increasing U.S. military strength, but also, throwing some bones to the fracking industry, right? And so just like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is that sort of mega omnibus law that basically does everything under the sun, but in particular tries to boost clean energy production, right? It also, this is what Biden had to do, he had to negotiate, right, with Manchin. So he said, let's get some baiters for the fuel industry. So what's going to happen is if Harris gets elected, she'll likely just continue along the Biden path. Now, so there's really not a lot to say, but what is very troubling about Harris is what she said so far is her support for militarism and ongoing genocide perpetrated by Israel and the United States on Palestinians. Right? We now know, thanks to research, that the Pentagon is the world's largest institutional user of petroleum and the single largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world. It actually surpasses entire countries. So if you really want to reduce the carbon emissions, you got to think about reducing some of the fossil fuel impacts of military industrial conflict. Kamala Harris, no intention. Now, I almost don't want to even pay respect to Trump's lies. He has called climate change a hoax. He thinks that windmills harm whales, right? He said the most ridiculous things. The reason why I became a citizen in 2020 was because he was talking about deporting Muslims. I'm not Muslim, but I'm not white, and so I was actually frankly terrified about his activities here. But you know what he did during when he was in power? He appointed Scott Pruitt as the head of EPA. The guy is like falling in bed with the fossil fuel industry. He denies climate change. Right? This whole 2025 actually will reduce support for forecasting hurricanes. Right? So it will gut NOAA, it will gut the Weather Service. It won't even give you the information you need, and it calls to sort of the people in my field and it calls to people as well as the climate change alarm industry, and it's trying to basically stabilize that. So it's hard to know where to begin with those lies, and of course we can talk a little bit more about how to fight that well beyond the ballot box. But I just want to lay out for you that it is a whole can of lies.
I'm gonna just use that all the time now. All can of love that. Thank you. And our last speaker, Dr. Wong.
Thank you. Actually, that is a really great segue into my remarks. I wanted to, before I start, just be clear about what I mean by state violence, right? I want to be clear about the fact that I'm referring to state violence as a way that the state employs violence to organize and enforce, or Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes as, quote, differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Right, so this cuts across all of these issues, right? And just to be clear, this is of course Gilmore's definition of racism, right? So this is how the racial justice literally grounds any conversation we have about state violence. Right? And so now we see this in this election cycle with one presidential candidate touting to have the quote most lethal military in the world, right? And another presidential candidate stressing that, quote, for people who fear the United States, you need to wage peace through strength. So the use of such illogics, right, obscures the fact that in the past year alone, the U.S. is over $17.9 billion in military aid to Israel, has assisted in the dropping of over 75,000 tons of bombs. That is the equivalent of 5 atomic bombs from that killed over 42,000 Palestinians, 2/3 of whom were women and children, and displaced more than 1.9 million people. Right? Again, to put this into perspective, that is 9 out of 10 Gazans have been displaced at least once in this past year. Right? And then to loop this back to reproductive politics, an estimated 43,000 of whom are pregnant women, according to the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency. And these are only numbers that have been documented. This is under population. Right? The extension of such state violence in this election cycle through also the dehumanization and criminalization of those who are most vulnerable due to the organized abandonment here and abroad under the name of narrowly defined safety in terms of border control, criminal justice, and national security. Via the criminalizing of homelessness by the Supreme Court last June, to the police shooting of metro goers that were fair meeting in New York City this last month in September, the refurbishing of age-old stereotypes, and I'm talking about centuries-old stereotypes, right, of migrants as quote-unquote illegal and dog and cat eaters, to mark them as biopolitical and civilizational threats to control, contain, and exploit. This is also tied to the state-sponsored execution of Freddie Owens and Marcus Marcellus, Khalifa Williams just last month. While state violence runs through all of these issues, right, discussed on this panel so far, since we're holding this conversation at a university campus, I'd like to focus my remarks on the way state violence manifests specifically, like for instance, in the militarized suppression of anti-war, anti-apartheid, and anti-genocide student movements. We have been witnessing this nationally, internationally, and on our very campus, right? With the deployment of AUPD with zip ties and the intimidating presence of armed MPD in response to student protests just a few weeks ago. Not unlike the organized revolts in American campuses at the height of U.S. wars in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in the 60s, the Gaza Solidarity Encampments last spring clarified the links between racialized state violence in the U.S. and U.S. imperial violence abroad. As historian Simeon Mann notes, the expansion of the U.S.'s capacity to criminalize and make war in the second half of the century has functioned through, not in spite of, its proclaimed commitment to racial equality and democracy. You get that? We wage war under the name of freedom of the people. Are with me so far? So the U.S. modernized global infrastructure of containment and control through the build-out of the border patrol, military, and the criminal justice system at the same time that it proclaimed itself the leader and enforcer of so-called free world since the act of World War II. While not unprecedented within these genealogies of anti-war and anti-resistance mobilizations, the solidarity encampments this year, along with their militarized suppression, are, however, unfolding at a pivotal juncture in U.S. higher education history. As Dr. Kirsty Gore notes, the suppression must be understood in relation to larger campaigns to dismantle affirmative action and DEI programming that bans ethnic studies and gender studies in elementary school, middle school, high school, and college campuses. Further, this moment of retrenchment against critical studies comes after decades of state investment in higher education and relentless narrowing of educational access through political economic policies that simultaneously increase and individualize costs. The U.S. federal government's defunding of higher education, coupled with the curtailment of educational access and equity, have created conditions in which the U.S. universities are deeply dependent on the state's military-industrial complex, the very dependency that the student protesters are demanding the university to disclose and divest from. In 2020, for instance, the government's funding for a single military contractor, Lockheed Martin, exceeded the entire funding for the Department of Education as a whole. Decades of state divestment in public education have converged with a growing emphasis on sponsored research, and in an era of ballooning student debt, a lot of you know about this, right? The billions in annual investment in prop-up university budgets and subsidized student education. Not only has the Defense Department become the third largest source of federal research development funding in the university in the past decade, universities have become funneling sites for weapons contractors in the defense industry. Given this context, the militarized suppression of student protesters must be understood in relation to how the very universities that deploy riot police and state troopers armed with tear gas, flash bombs, tasers, sniper rifles, and armored vehicles against their own students. They are all deeply entangled in the larger military industry that fuels and profits off of perpetual war. So for context, the shares of US-based weapons suppliers, including Lockheed Martin, RTC, which is formerly Raytheon, and L3Harris, have risen 30 to 60% this past year. Further, last year in 2023, U.S. military spending expanded to $825 billion through the Defense Policy Bill passed by Congress. That is more than the military spending of 9 countries, including China, Russia, and the United Kingdom combined. And a 24% increase in military research and development costs from the previous decade. This is a number that does not include the later approved $95 billion supplementary bill, which tied military aid to Israel to that of Ukraine and Taiwan. The expansion of military spending grows the capacity of militarized police at home and occupations overseas, which disproportionately devastates communities of color, Black and Indigenous lives in particular. And so now to circle back to how such operations of state violence manifest in this upcoming elections, I'd like to echo what all of you have been already stressing, right? To see the elections as one of the emerging considerations that sets the terrain, right, on which these issues are revealed, struggled, and negotiated. Demand for accountability, right? Ballot box being one of the many strategies we can use to build and leverage war and hard power together. Thank you.
Thanks to all three of you for that. And after those incredible kind of opening comments, I want to actually break it down a little bit more to some specific questions. I'm going to throw these out to specific panelists if you're okay with that. So, Molly, I would love to hear you talk about how, given your work in DC, how these issues of climate injustice and environmental racism play out in our local elections.
Yeah, I'm sure for many of you know that DC has been a very, very rapidly gentrifying city over the last decade, and due no small part to Mayor Bowser's very pro-developer, and the mayor before that, very pro-developer stances. And so you really have a kind of, some people might even sort of call it a land grab and turnover of previously lower income African American, areas, housing areas, to higher income, whiter buyers, and kind of switch right in a very racial fabric of the city over the last 20 years. And what you see happening is more and more African Americans and other minorities, but largely African Americans coming to across the river. And so this has a very interesting history in and of itself. In fact, many of the older African American neighborhoods here in the Capitol Hill area were displaced to get adopted class in the mid 20th century in that period known as urban renewal and beautification, where they were moving and destroying some alleys that included African Americans east of the river. But that whole area east of the river is very flood prone. It's also it's called the adopted class, like created by the National Park Service. Out of dredging across the river. And it's also well known that there is flooding along the Lost Branch, there is sewer overflows, there is higher contamination across the river. So there's legacy forms of environmental toxicity and racism that then only is compounded on evidence, and also legacy health issues. I don't know if people know this, but there's actually no emergency departments in war settings. There's no trauma. So there's no single hospital east of across the river that can deal with a kind of trauma or emergency care, right? And so what that means is for children with pediatric asthma patients, right? Pediatric asthma is very much a disease of race and poverty. force the issue. But, so you have these layers of health-related, right, toxicity, lack of green cover that are all besetting areas of the Hudson River that of course are also kind of hotspots. Part of my work is to look at that longer history and to look at sort of below the radar, transformative justice and abolitionist ethics and practices that can actually confront, right, these conjoined issues of racism and environmental.
This is so incredibly helpful, and so I think, I will just chip in here. I think many of us, especially when we're first voting, you kind of get through, you get through national, you get through, there are a few things, you maybe get all the way down to, your board, city council, and then you maybe get the school board, and then you kind of start to peter off. But this is, I think, where when we're thinking about who are the people who establish voting laws, right? How do we figure out where development is allowed to happen in a city like DC? This is actually what affects the life chances of Black and brown kids, right? So that, I think, is a really key point. I want to sort of move on from here to think about, I think we've unfortunately talked a lot about what elections put on the table and what is at stake, but also what is limited in terms of any single election. So I'd love to turn it over to Dr. Weiss and Dr. Long for a minute. So how do we mobilize in the lead-up to elections if we know the elections aren't going to save us? And then how do we mobilize beyond elections if we know that even if we elect a candidate who says Roe v. Wade, it's not going to get us where we need to be. You want to go first this time? No.
Well, so in the context of reproduction, it's important to recognize something that you have said for years, right? Which is politics of reproduction represent a sort of slave episteme, which is this idea that we have a country built on the idea that control of reproduction is linked to the economy. It's central to the core of our sort of nation state. And so the understanding that we would manage the future of our economy and the future of our politics through the reproductive management of bodies is sort of baked into us. So I think the first thing in mobilization is to recognize, to understand that nothing is a sort of neutral policy. Everything is doing work on behalf, and I would say on behalf of the right? And so it's about always going to the root of the policy and even understanding that as we take an incremental win, somebody's left out, always left out of the story. And so we should be imagining how we're mobilizing for the next thing. So thinking about the ballot initiative. So if we were to have a ballot initiative to reinstate abortion up to the point of legal life. Right now, abortion is banned at around 6 weeks of pregnancy. A lot of people live in the state and will benefit from the ballot initiative. But there will be a whole bunch of people who continue to get left out of the story. And I've been surprised at how little attention there is to, okay, so what's the next ballot initiative we're working towards? And often we use political messaging that makes that next act work. So I think that the most important thing is to imagine how to focus on incremental wins that don't make the long-term process. And so full decriminalization of abortion, right? Full decriminalization of outcomes is not actually seen as a potential in the way in which we argue for the current. And so I think that's always for me where I want to center discussions about election is I'm not asking you or thinking about that there won't be some value to these incrementalism, but when incrementalism makes liberation impossible, then we need to rethink our narrative around the incremental.
Great answer, right? And this is why every time you hear somebody say, all we need to do is return to Roe, it's explain to them why that's just the starting point. Okay, Dr. Long.
I have a very quick response to this. So if you do agree that elections is, just going to be leveraging power, I think the way that I've learned from my elders has always been to build power with those that are most affected and have already been doing the work, and to use the grassroots organizations that have preserving folks that have survived state violence and have making sure that they're alive and living. And so find and learn, right, from the boards who have been, for instance, serving migrant workers, working for housing justice, community mutual aid, who have been organizing against police violence, detention, and deportation in your own local community, right? Plug in to learn from their tactics and strategies through and beyond the elections. Attend their teach-ins, right? Their townhouse. Do they have election guides, right? What are their strategies to put pressure on particular candidates with particular issues, block or push particular bills? And this is a few examples here that I know people here already are involved in. Locally in DC, I look to organizations such as Fairness Wildwood Springs, a Black-led community defense hub centering Black lives at risk for state-sanctioned and inter-community violence in the DC area. They, for instance, have a teach-in tomorrow, right, on how DC Council functions, how it ties into issues of DC statehood, what statehood means for the community, and how it connects to global solidarity efforts for demilitarization and detransformation. I know if you are already involved with them present here. Nationally, organizations like Dissenters make the connection between militarism against Black and Latinx communities in the U.S. as well as wars abroad. Right? They organize movement workers from different backgrounds, labor, racial justice, criminal justice reform, climate, and immigrant justice to resist wars waged abroad, and also at home through policing, ICE, and other agencies and communities within the U.S. AU also has a student chapter, so you can go ahead and plug in and get involved here. So while the elections are literally a limited and routine platform to advocate for change, it is one that we can use to sharpen our strategic acumen and build our relational power. This year, as we know, elections is not a singular election cycle, so we need to practice, right, and create the foresight to build ways through together. Thank you.
So I'm going to open it up to Q&A now. And before I do, I just want to say that some of you are going to have to go, and you're still going to have questions. And some of you are like, wow, that was a lot of information. Wait, which were those states? Wait, is it Colorado or Louisiana? And I will say that as we've been doing our deep dive as a center over the last few weeks and months into these racial justice issues, we even today was like, have we figured out the visa climate bill about the coastal or the tax? Is it good? Is it like, are they the right? What is happening? So we know this is a lot. And it's not going to happen in one camera. So I want you to be sure to be on the lookout for our How's Racial Justice on the Ballot resource guide for voting in 6 key issues: immigration, educational equity, reproductive justice, climate and the environment, war and militarism, and policing and mass incarceration. We'll be dropping at the end of this week, beginning next week. We'll see how the social media world works. And it will include both big overviews as well as specific issues for you to tune into and resources to touch down on to get more informed before you go to either protest at the polls, stage your sit at the next event, or vote, or all of the above. So, thank you, my panelists. It's open to Q&A. You can do either one tonight. Go to mine. Go to mine. Just go to mine for these ones. And if you guys have to go, it's not a big deal. No classes start at 2:30.
I don't know. Okay. My question is really with regards to Trumpism. I feel like it's kind of obvious that Trumpism isn't just going to like dissipate and no longer exist after this election, no matter who wins the presidency. So I guess my question is, how do we address Trumpism and far right geopoliticism in organizing space after this election? Because it's going to
Yeah, and that is an important nail on it. Trumpism So I think what gives me hope is the very real racial demographic shift happening in the United States, where you're seeing, certainly, more and more people of color, musicians now being able to vote. I think though that is also being countered by potentially being more conservative, set of Latinx voters as well. So we've been really, the racial breakdown has been very much fascinating this coming election. I know the last election, and the one before that, there was a lot of talk about sort of working class that voters become. But even that was a little bit, it's not because people who were of, rural, white voters above like $67,000 a year, and we're going to this kind of this sort of long of numbers, right? So I guess I have really an answer how to tackle except, be really on the lookout for the intersectional forms of organizing exactly as Juan was talking about, right? Across these spheres where people are making these connections, I think in a way that we need in order to fight this sort of enduring power of them. I'll leave it there and see if you all have more words of hope.
So Arlie Hochschild has a good book out in which she does a really nice job of naming that Trump is their bully, right? So they can understand him as a bully and his crass, but he's their bully, and he is out there to defend them from the line jumpers. So line jumpers are people of color and women who benefited more sort of from the post-1960s changes in society. So I think we just have to sort of start to name the sort of racialized resentment that underscores Trump and stop attributing it to him, but recognize he's just a reflection of that generation. And then so I would say the other thing that, so white women in Instagram, like we're just a general example of and so I think we have work to do. We have work to do in white men because that's a place where recognizing how all of these issues are actually central for women is an important piece of the education process. I don't think that's people in this room. That's not your job. That's people like me. And then I would say the other thing we have to really recognize is the extent to which colonialism is on a brand new country. And it's, I think there's not enough attention to how Trumpism and colonialism are playing out. And as the benefits get extended in different communities, so access to IVF, even potentially, which may seem like positive pieces, actually work to reduce differences and potentially even stoke racialized so I think that we have to crack them about trying why Trump is popular. And I think that's just a challenging project, but what I question is going to go.
Honestly, yeah, I agree with what I was saying about, and I do think that the framing of font is important. I think positioning is what we're presenting that as like exceptional movement, but actually a pattern history of histories of white supremacy, racial capitalism, and empire. And so there are scholars that have been doing this, that I'll just, drop, doing that as a case on like construction, new period as he basically wrote that book in response to and his argument that this is actually happening. And the fact that we are at this moment shocked. We should not be shocked with actually not history. And so we need to do more digging work and collaborative work. And going back to Molly's point, it is also a transnational issue. Right? Because it does not end and start at the border destination. This is part of a long history and our lives are actually Trump is fully full of legal cases against him, right? And also, if you think about it, Trump is a representative of crony capitalism, right? Kind of white supremacist crony capitalism. And so there are also, I think, ways not just to reframe the narrative, to reframe sort of the economically devastating nature of Trumpism. Like it's basically, it's in so many ways robbing the public, right? And that's what Trump sells at, robbing the public. And so Trumpism, in all its real estate deals, and not through as a judge, actually a book about corruption in real estate, and Trump is very clear that there's been new tools to actually call attention to those illicit financial flows that Trumpism is about, and so that might be one creative way beyond the white supremacist way, like so, of reframing how we attack them.
I think all of those are brilliant, and I'm gonna chime in here as the moderator. I just want to say one thing because I can't help myself. I completely agree with all of this, and particularly, I think Billy and Tracy, your points about the sort of roots of this in a particular kind of white ressentiment, right? This kind of anxiety that is very much like the sort of end of radical reconstruction and that kind of white resentment. It's about the sort of nadir in that white resentment. You kind of go through the sort of NIMBY period and the white flight after the civil rights movement and the rise of the sort of Reagan state rights white conservatism. It can form a moral majority. Like none of this is new. We've seen these kinds of things happen before. And yet it becomes very easy, and I think it was something when I lived in Ohio during George W.'s election against Kerry. It's very easy for progressive folks, and particularly white progressive folks, to be like, oh, they're just such fools. How can you fight people, blah, 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 and they're racist, and they're this, and they're that. And I find it really wonderful. Not because I'm trying to go, make friends and become my eye and you're the bunch of Trumpists, but because I keep going back to Bill Rodriguez's white reconstruction, but also to W.E.B. Du Bois's black reconstruction. And then the text that ties the two together for me, David Roediger's Wages of Whiteness, where he takes a line from Du Bois, where Du Bois points out that as white ethnics and the white working class were stripped of so many forms of labor protection, access to housing, enfranchisement, and all of these other things, what held them together was white supremacy. What held them together is even as they are being exploited by industrial capitalism, at least they had that invisible wage of whiteness. And that the only way to exercise that and glorify that property of whiteness was through anti-black racism. And so I would argue that while we don't have to kumbaya, we do have to continue to remember that there are core issues of racial capitalism, immigration, for example, right? The very issues that destabilize countries in the global south and drive migrant flows here are the conditions that make family farming and factory work here increasingly untenable and are stripping opportunities from the white working class. So when we can begin to identify those issues in racial capitalism that are actually feeding white resentment and white supremacy and are also disproportionately destroying the lives and opportunities of people of color, immigrants, and others in the U.S., then we can begin to frame what some might see as an idealistic campaign, but a movement to change the conditions that feed and support and justify that intense commitment to the wages of whiteness at the expense of everybody else. Because when we bring down those structures, then we have an entirely different proposition. It doesn't have to be that we don't recognize with them, though I don't know if you might argue that you would. But what we do have to do is think about what are the issues that would actually make life better for everyone, and how do we fight on this?
Jump in. I just want to say, I want to connect this conversation to my answer earlier about the elections, just to give a little concrete example. So, in the fight for reproductive, for abortion rights on the ballot, the single most popular message is keep the government out of business. goes really well, it gets people, but at the heart of that message is exactly what we were talking about. And so we are leveraging in our effort to win one issue, a kind of re-entrenchment into this idea that the government doing something good for someone, in this specific means bad, but it's practically the same narrative, is what we need to abandon. The government is intrinsically wrong, intrinsically harmful. We should turn to capitalists, we should turn to the business community to have our solutions. And so that's what I mean by incrementalist narratives that make liberation possible. You don't have to fight for abortion rights through that narrative, but we do because it really is grounded in a sort of in an understanding that the state is a problem because the state helps protect the people to the disadvantage of others.
Other questions? We're gonna batch them. Ask them and then we'll answer it. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Can I ask here or should I go to the mic or?
You can ask there, just ask loud.
Okay, I wanted to ask for more clarification on how AU works with art stealers like Rocky Mountain ITC. And I wanted to ask if the genocide on Gaza continues, how does that keep AU running as an institution? Like, can AU exist as an institution without war and vice versa? Or how does that work?
That's a great one, and that's going to go to Dr. Wong. Start thinking of your answer. 2.
Yeah, I had two. One was related to that. I guess just in schooling, like interacting with people that were for the World Bank or IMF or the CIA, face-to-face kind of I guess I know we didn't touch on educational equity much, but I guess it's this fight between trying to get more people educated, but that being educated like at an institution like this means more likelihood of interacting with harmful people. And even just from hearing that someone wants to work for the CIA after everything, it just feels like a direct message of hate. But then also just what you were saying about my experience of where I'm from is Trump supporters live in trailer parks. And it's a knowledge that they will send all their money to Trump. They want all of the Trump money because they believe they will be saved by him. But that person that I will interact with, I have more of a connection to than a progressive that exists. So many people. But I guess when talking about Anacostia, a lot of the restaurant service workers here are from Southeast DC. And when we talk about building that community, it comes with AU doesn't want them talking to us. Like I'll interact with them and they'll say like I cannot listen talking to you, like my boss would get that. And just how to exist in this institution that has so many ways to restrict community building. It's kind of interesting.
Okay, so I'm going to send the part about building community, the other part of the AU probability question to Molly. Will you take?
Well, the first part about jobs is a good one for me.
Yes.
SAS.
Yes, that is actually a really good one. And I'm actually going to send back to Lily actually the one about like the whole inside outside. 3. I love it. You can watch the recording of the question.
As a young generation, we want to such a oppressive, put in place of justice and degradation and discovery. I'm reminded of the quote by David Jacobs. He said that power can see something. I have a 2-part question about what it look like for power not to demand, what it look like for power to actually see a active power of the opposite power. Active power doesn't see.
I like that. Okay. Thank you. Okay, and last.
My question is kind of disjointed, but I am from Ireland, which is like
Yeah.
6-week abortion ban, school vouchers, attacks on transgender students. DEI has already been banned up and down. So like, there's just a lot that has happened, and there's very little, I guess, framing of like the centering of all of these issues is white children who are missing out on public funds for public school. It's always white women who are going to be attacked and criminalized for seeking abortion and like healthcare. So I guess I truly want to know, because I grew up there my entire life, that's my home. How can I encourage other people to begin to flip this narrative and be aware and actually subscribe to like fighting to, I guess, actually include these voices in the conversations? Because we have a lot of people of color, surprisingly, who are running for offices, which is absolutely shocking. Like, I was able to vote for 4 people of color in Iowa, which is crazy to me. But like at the end of the day, they're still limited by the overwhelming power of white supremacy, of even more the maturity that is just like so prominent in these positions. So my question is, honestly, I might not be a solution, but I don't think about that.
Yeah, how do you do that work in these all white spaces? So we're gonna switch, because that is all you. I mean, aside from her clear analysis of whiteness, also she doesn't know. Okay, so let's do it this way. Let's go right down the line.
I won't have a satisfactory response. I'm so sorry. But I think you have pointed to really the core factors of this. I think the general response one is like figure it out, right? Push the university to disclose the numbers. Figure out the numbers. Figure out how we are actually dependent. How are the tuition dollars actually dependent? Right? Who's getting paid what? Right? Where is this money going to? Why are these tuition dollars going? And then on top of that, well, I think another unsatisfying response would be this, is that I always see myself, I come from a multi-generational organizing family, and our whole family has an organization. And I think to think about the fact that our current conditions have been trained to understand that I would not be here without her before, right? So to understand that there's always ways in which we can always some ways of making under conditions of that, including making very clear the distinction between education and educational institutions. That will be so far, right? I see myself as an educator, and I'm a student. I would love to be in a world in which those things are completely we're not there yet. And so we need to organize and develop it to make sure we have like pathways in which, from that Tracy's point, that those conditions of liberation are tenable, right? And we define strategic acumen in order to have towards that direction. We're not, so sorry, it's not really satisfying. I think your question on careers gets a very philosophical question that I have in mind, which is change the way and change right? And so I'm a professor at SIS. Many students aspire to work at the World Bank or at other USIP or at the State Department, right? Now, I'm not going to sit here and say, after speaking on this, that you should work this whole district, right? So part of me also has a very pragmatic answer. You know, you should be able to work where you get a job, and that is really but also do not lose hope in the potential of changing from within. We are having a panel that ARPC is putting on October 29th, sent from within. All the U.S. government officials, they actually resigned. But the fact is that there are these powerful, ethical, committed, compassionate voices also in the government. To get back to your earlier point, you can't throw the state out, right? You cannot just have your singular focused government bad, because that's actually not helping anybody, and it's actually not even true in many ways, right? There's the old organizing phase about leverage. Where are those points of maneuver within the World Bank, within the State Department, right? Within these seemingly hegemonic
hegemonic monolithic organizations, but that there's actually people who are, influencing meetings, changing the wording on reports, because they fought really hard overnight to get this paragraph in that, acknowledges something that otherwise the powers that we couldn't acknowledge. So I think that we have to keep that part of our strategy as well. Otherwise, we have, that multi-pronged nature of, a broad, liberatory emancipatory agenda, has to be part of the picture. And so that's why, as I said, with the CIA, maybe crossing the line of change from within, but a lot of the other organizations that you named right there, I think, in particular, World Bank is like super messy, like, it's neoliberal, and it's like, it has been like disruptive and stuff. But there are also some really fascinating critiques and critics within the World Bank that I think are really fascinating. So I'll just leave it at that, and say that I think that we have to have that dialectic of change inside.
They want you to give up. So don't give up. Like, don't give up on your state. I mean, I think that Iowa was a perfect example, right? So people remember that Iowa was the first state in the Supreme Court to grant marriage equality, right? So there's this sort of long history of much more expansiveness in Iowa that then it confronts immigration of people, right? And so Iowa is fighting for this sort of moment in which it has a demographic that is changing and a history that people are trying to hold on to. But some of why they're being diversity, equity, inclusion, and some of why there is this massive natalism going on in Iowa is concern about that change. So we can hold on to the positive because that could be a better. This could be representative of that, but it could be better. But I think it's a, can you find your way in your feet there? And I spent a lot of time in Omaha. We did a lot of organizing. Right now, it looks like there is a blue dot, right? So Omaha, like people that it's kind of like college, the Harris, that like people that left Democratic House member, and for the first time, there is a potential for a non-Republican to win the Senate seat. So a lot of things. And then a lot of lawsuits. We hear the argument that don't give up, but as Professor Captain said earlier, don't be fooled into the idea that the election is going to be change. Just one piece of a result of community organizing. But Iowa's had a number of these massive climate events. Yeah, so it also is an opportunity to try to we're talking together with all of the give up.
So I will close us down, and I'm going to liaison on, but I will say this, actually, you have to answer first question first about power and see what better. So here's what I would say. On one scale, I would say that yes, power does concede, and it only concedes to demands. And I would say that on the level of organizing. So, for example, precisely the question you're raising, we all now have for reproductive justice. It just rolls off the tongue, reproductive justice. You go to NARAL and they're like reproductive justice, and you go to NOW and they're like reproductive justice, and you go to Ms. Magazine and they're like reproductive justice. These are the people that when I was still even older than you, we would sit there and go to every single pro-choice and reproductive rights meeting that were almost entirely white, where they talked about white women's reproductive issues and white women's this and white women's that, and choice and that, and my second baby and my IUD failed, and we would just sit there and be like, we are not interested in your pro-choice platform. We want to talk about reproductive justice. Why are we not talking about compulsory sterilization? Why are we not talking about family caps for temporary families? Why are we not talking about welfare checks that force people to get money from their abusers? Like, why are we not talking about the ways in which these issues are raised? And that idea that we move from the right to have an abortion, reproductive rights, the right to contraception, reproductive rights, to the idea of reproductive justice, that everybody who wants to have a child should be able to have a child, and everybody who doesn't should not have to. That was the work of women, and we always say, oh, the white women should work with the white women. Honestly, that was the work of women of color and people of color showing up over and over and being like, you don't get to leave us out. And it has changed. It took 30 years, 80 to now 40 years, but it happens. So yes, Howard does not concede without it. That's what we're talking about. What Kimberly Crenshaw calls sort of the intersectional politics of like how identities are formed and how movements are shaped. On the other hand, when we are talking about power and state power, I'm still feeling the anarchist at heart. Like the power concedes nothing. They never concede. It adapts, it changes, it rearticulates, it includes and excludes, it plots, it makes new historical blocks that include some of you and pit you against the rest of you, so that more people get included at the price of others, they can block the door. Power concedes nothing. What has to happen is you have to seize power. And I don't mean you seize power necessarily by fighting a war. I mean that is not, I'm not opposed to Detroit things, but I'm not suggesting you all go fight a war. Let that be on the record. What I mean is that when the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party sat outside on that boardwalk at the 1964 convention, and they would not leave because they would not be seated on the floor, and they elected their own delegates, and they demanded in front of absolutely everybody. They forced that shift in the Democratic Party, not because they made a demand, but because they willed it into being through their bodies and their presence. They seized power. And this is important on this campus right now, because this campus is trying to tell you that what it means to engage in civic discourse is that you only ask for inclusion. You never seize power. And if that might be the case on a college campus with policies that you have to stand by in order to be part of this community, that you cannot break without consequences. But that is not the lesson taken out into the world. You are actually seeking to create transformative justice. And this goes back to my last comment. Do not get it twisted. These predominant white institutions are not for you. They are not the places that you're going to friends or build your community. These are the wedding stones where we sharpen our knowledge, our analysis, and our skills. These are the crucibles where we build our strength and our ability to work across boundaries that we did not know we knew how to. These are the testing grounds where we set our limits and develop our sparring about what we will and will not productive, and we learn that that in ways that still allow us access if and when we want. Get your sustenance and your support in the enclaves and continue funding these institutions. Benefit from them because they will do so much. But do not imagine that just because they are privileges, right? These institutions are sites of incredible privilege. You never have to give back. That does not mean that they are not valuable. So do not get it twisted. You may not like everybody, but they're not going to make you check trauma. Not because the people who are mean members or all this is complicated, but that's the nature of white supremacy. But you're here to do something else. All of you, you're here to do something more than build a community. Build a community where you find it. And with that, I'll call it.
And